Hi everyone! I hope you're all having a great week. Oops, I was excited to get going and I completely forgot to turn on my camera. So basically the first thing I did after pulling out my watercolor journal is I spritzed the page I'm working on with a little bit of water where I'm applying the paint right now. And as you can see, I'm also using my water spray bottle to move that paint around by spritzing a little bit more water on it as well. So this week I'll be working on another watercolor abstract of sorts. It's going to be a little bit of experimentation. There are certain things I want to try and I'm not 100% sure how they'll go. And I also want to show you how you can use different products to cover iridescent paints, because sometimes if you try to doodle over iridescent paint, it doesn't really the ink doesn't cover all that well, and the iridescent paint seems to bleed through. So I'll show you how to work around this. The first step in any one of my painting processes is always about me choosing my color palette. And I always do this off camera. It's a lot easier for me to do it that way, and it feels more natural and spontaneous for me to explore this way. Since I generally work mostly intuitively, I also give myself permission to make changes or additions when I start my painting process. In this case, I had initially set out to work with Quinacridone Rose, Buff Titanium, and Intense Blue Phthalo Blue. And as I started to apply the paint, I felt like it was going to be just a little bit too much blue on the bottom. So I decided to also add some nickel azo yellow, and that was purely kind of a gut decision. I see every painting I make as a chance to explore and discover either new ways of creating or how I can use old techniques to make something appear new. So I'm always experimenting, and my journal is a great place for me to do that. It's for me. I'm sharing it with you here, but I don't intend to sell these paintings. So whatever I create in there really is only for my benefit, and I guess in this case also so you can have a chance to see what my process looks like when I'm experimenting and playing in my watercolor journal. In sharing this with you, my hope is that I'll encourage you to do the same. And by giving yourself permission to have a place where you can purely play and explore and experiment, it will help release some of that pressure you may feel from having to create something beautiful or perfect every single time. And that's what art is most of the time. It's exploration. It's a way to express ourselves. And sometimes how we see things in our head, or how we'd like to show them to show up on our piece of paper or our canvas or whatever, it can be kind of hard to translate that to a substrate. So it's good to have places where we can just be free from that pressure and give ourselves a chance to explore and play. And usually when we're playing and having fun in this free kind of a way, we can make very cool discoveries. Sometimes little happy accidents happen. I think it was Bob Ross that talked about that. But it's true, like happy accidents can happen. So something you may have not intended to do might happen. And you may in fact discover that this is a new way or a new technique or a new mark that you really love, and this will move you along for your next art project. After letting the first layer dry, I decided to use my watercolors again to create some shapes. I'll be using the same colors that I applied in my background, but I'll use them in a more intense, less diluted form. Because the paint in the background is completely dry, and also because it was applied in a very diluted form, when I'm applying this second layer of colors, I don't have to worry about picking up the colors that are on the bottom. One quality of watercolors that I really like is the fact that they are transparent, especially when they're applied in thin layers. And so some of the different shapes from my background are gonna show through unless I apply my paint very thickly. I've pulled out my gold and I'm applying it into my shapes now that they're still wet, because I want that gold to spread into the shapes and not be very opaque. I've changed my brush to a flat brush, and now I'm going to use some of that gold to apply a little ribbon of gold on the quote-unquote horizon line of my painting. I love how the gold, when it's thicker and more intense, is more opaque, and then as I keep pulling my brush it becomes more transparent and some of the background is visible. I'm going to continue that ribbon to the right of this circle. However, I do wish I had applied my paint from right to left instead of left to right, because it would have faded in the same way that it did on the left side, more towards the center and close to the circle. But that's something I learned, and if I repeat this in another painting, then I can do it then. I've given my second layer of paint a chance to dry, and now I've pulled out my fine tip ballpoint pen to start adding some elements. And just little doodles, very simple lines. I'll probably add some dots, but as per usual, I always like to try and keep it as simple as possible when I'm doodling. Otherwise, it gets a little bit too overwhelming and busy. I pulled out my clear ruler here just to make sure that the lines I'm creating on each side of the ribbon and then on the other side of the circle line up with each other. But I prefer to draw the lines freehand when I'm doing them rather than use a ruler, because I really like the look of the imperfect lines. They look somewhat straight, somewhat squiggly, and I think that really adds some interest. I'm continuing to work with the same fine tip pen, and this time I'm just adding some little dots. I love creating intuitively because it's another way of freeing myself in my process. There's no obligation for me to make things a certain way. I can explore, like I've said before, and I can experiment. And if things work out, great. If they don't, I'm always learning. My plan, if I can call it a plan, is just always to be as flexible and adaptable as possible in my creative process. I've pulled out my Pilot fountain pen and I'm going to color in those two arches. I'm actually not really happy with how the pen is working on this paper, as it seems to be bleeding. The ink is bleeding and it's not leaving very sharp lines. It doesn't do this on all the paper I use, but I think this journal in particular has cotton paper, and for whatever reason it's bleeding. So I'll pull out another marker to try and fix this afterwards. This Tombow marker I've just pulled out works far better on this paper and doesn't have the same effect, that same bleeding effect that the other pen had. So I'll use this moving forward if I want to color in anything. I'm sensing that my painting could use some highlights, so I've pulled out my white pen. I've decided to use a stylus to add some dots of gold. I did the same in that center circle, but I don't really like that a whole lot, so I'm going to paint a ring instead of those dots, and I think I'll like that way better. Yes, I definitely like the ring better. When I add splatters to a painting, I generally like to do it at the very end of my painting process, but I have some that gold paint left on my brush and I don't want to waste it, so I'll add the splatters now. I want this specific circle to become my focal point, so I'm going to start working on adding some more details to it. And I think these arches could also use a few more details. I like this black marker by Tombow because I can create relatively precise lines, and it has a dual tip so I can use the brush tip for painting in some of that black color. Now, one thing I'm not crazy about with this black marker is the fact that the gold that's on the background is bleeding through the color, so my black isn't as intense as I'd like it to be. But I know how to correct this. Before I make this correction, however, I'll add a few more details to my focal point. I ran a little test on a separate sheet, and this black India ink is perfect to go over that gold. Since the gold doesn't bleed through this India ink, I'll use it to color in the center of my focal point. I really love the intensity of this black ink, so I'll add a little bit more of it in a few details on my painting. And with that, I'm ready to call my painting complete. I had lots of fun working on this little project in my watercolor journal. Circles, lines, and dots are certainly some of my favorite marks to create. What are your favorite marks to create? I'd love to read your questions or comments in the section below. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!